The Magnificent Moreci by M. A. Turner. Chapter 1. It was roughly 4 in the morning when Athie called. I was sitting at my desk as I always did, sipping the same cup of tea I always sipped. He told me about the things that went on across the bay. A wealthy man was hosting a midnight party and it was quite the rager. I wasn't sure what that was supposed to mean, but I was happy that he was enjoying it. Since I moved in a few weeks before, he kept me up to date on the current events in the hills. It was ironic, considering that he didn't live there. He lived in Manhattan and drove all the way to go to these parties. I wasn't aware, until he mentioned that he attended the parties himself, that he was driving the entire 2-hour distance in heavy traffic to get there at 1 in the morning. Though he called me regularly about some guy throwing parties near me, I wasn't quite impressed. The Roberts threw get-togethers, sometimes, but nobody ever talks about them. It was almost impressive how frequently he mentioned this man, so much that I was questioning whether he was going to make moves on the poor guy. It was weird enough that he had the layout of the house memorized, even more so that he was telling me about the opulence of it in fine detail. It was a far cry from the college I was living in at the time. In the remote cottage house on the northern side of North Hills, it was all my father was willing to put me up in. I didn't attest. I was grateful that he was willing to not only put me up in North Hills, but also pay for my degrees that I got. Though I didn't actually have a job yet, he didn't mind. He set me up on a payment line and wired funds to me every week. I was just thankful that I had a father that cared about my dreams. I'd always wondered how life would have turned out differently had I, the man I would become, chosen to live back home in Wyoming. It wasn't something that I was too interested in pondering. After all, I haven't the need to worry with such things. Beyond what my father knew, I was trying to make it big and find my way in the world. What I couldn't bring myself to tell him was that this couldn't have been farther from the truth. I felt at home in the comforts of fitting in. One of the few things that eased the burden of being away from home was being in my own world. That was all I had. I had the same shirt as others did. I had the same smile. In a humorous way, the color that brightened me like the rest of New York. It only painted the same as everybody else. At first I wanted to stand out, but I soon found out that standing out has no feet to stand on. Not long after, I was back in the same boring routine of fitting in and being me, James Tamerlane, the oddity of the Tamerlane family. Even in the constant roar of betterment, the shining lock came first in terms of beauty. No matter how much I saw myself reflect off the water in the bay, I felt as though the bay kept me in its mind, no matter how far-fetched the notion may have seemed. What I did that morning, I did quite often. I sat in front of my lawn, right before the gentle ripples of the bay lapped at the edges of the tender weeds. My lattice chair was a different choice for me, but it was surprisingly sturdy, and also came with the house, which influenced my decision over one that I would have to buy. Didn't matter how nice the furnishings were, the cottage was all that I had. I was responsible for making this house into a home, and I still believe I did a horrid job of doing so. The phantasmal breath rapped against the lattice. Night has come for me, and no riches could save me from it. The soporific chime of my father's Rombach and Haas beguiled me to that dulce place of rest upon the midnight hour. It was against 3 o'clock that I had woken up, and taken Athie's call an hour later. He was never one to be brusque in his prattle, but rather turgid and blessed with the privilege of being dull. We were close, me and Athie, but I never propensed myself to be a boring person. I assumed that I had a flair that made life more compelling. As much as I loved my friend, he had the capability to fatigue a wolf to the point that it would return to its cave and feast another day. Over the glittering bay, this dark sky was a savior to the tired eyes of dawn. My eyes looked to the millions of white eyes that stared back at me. But millions of bodies looked back through me. There was but a radiance on my skin and warmth in my chest. In the line of homes under the moon, there were many that could be mentioned in full context, many that stood over at least one other home, and many that strode the very cache of wealth that came with such an opulent address. But out of every home that stood in the hills, there was only one that was truly worth mentioning in detail. A city that itself with homes to surround. On its own island under the moon, surrounded by its own siblings of crystal and crimson, stood a mansion in the mist, a mountain of ice and stone, the very home of a man who could be a New York god. Past the southern lock of New York stood the only isle in itself, a tower of wealth and wisdom that I can never forget for the rest of my life. A mansion that belonged to the one and only Jules Moreci, a man that I didn't know at the time, but grew to know, as expressed diligently in the workings of this book. The moon's mist with a dragon's breath upon the shining waves, pallid fog rising like the wings of Smaug on Erebor. I say the rippling water, a million dazzling lights reflecting off the waves. How I fancied to envisage such fantastical things in my short time in the North Hills, back reclined against the ground, eyes looking out to the tower, towering and brazen architecture across the bay. Surely now in my despondent and impetuous years from then, I have fondness still for the beauty that surrounded that North Hills mansion. I hold better memories of watching that mansion than the sparse memoirs I have of a contented infancy. When I looked upon it, it gave me the memories back that I had been losing all my life. Those brilliant little gems of hope that guide us through the hardship. It was quite demanding, the towering creature across the bay, beaming its radiance across half the bay. It demanded respect. It was sometime late in the afternoon when I was struck with the fancy, the overwhelming desire to gaze up at the stars. In actuality, I had been awoken by the phantasmal moaning of the bay, roaring in through the window. I was unnerved, quite reasonably in fact, to close the lattice and stay a few more hours in the kitchen. The constant wail of night bellowed out in the dark. It brought back a few memories of my younger years, those times that were more monotonous. I didn't miss those years, for it was the best of times for me. Waking up every morning to callous parents wasn't a kindly life. Patience grew with age, but it was lost to the whirlwind of growing up. Soon enough, it didn't mean the same thing. The years came with a cost, one I wasn't sure I could foot. Sometimes it wasn't the innervation of the world that drowned me in its mist, but rather the notion of the dark. I'd always had anxiety about it, those things unseen. It helped, though, that the luster of night had always been there for me. I wanted to sleep, but at times I never could. It was something about the thought of night, the overbearing sense of isolation that it brought. It was in times like those that my younger years were wrought from the same sense of sedition and frigidness that was common years later. As I looked off to the palace across the bay, there was something enchanting about it. Something so primal about a kingdom in itself. As I looked off into the distance, it was clear that his home was a beacon of light in the darkest dawn. There was something about the quality of a feral darkness, one which spread its mist upon the world, so drowned out by the circling lights of that North Hills estate. In a stupor, I made my way into the bedroom to rest, but being by the kitchen, its window also looked out across the bay. The soft purr of an orchestral sound, waking waves and shifting sands lulled me to a place of rest, one which held me in its grip, held me until it all faded out.